Amanda, do you want to mute the participants now or in a little bit?
I think we could probably mute them now. I guess we'll do a quick poll. Does anybody have any technical issues or questions that you need to ask before we get started? All right. If anyone has questions, then I encourage you to put them in the chat window, and we'll do our best to field them. Xander, if you could mute the participants now, that would be great, and I think we can get started.
Great.
All right. So thanks, everybody, for joining us. Again, this is the first webinar of the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange, and I'm just going to do a very brief intro in case you're not familiar with us before we get started with Greg's presentation. So as many of you know, there are knowledge exchanges or consortia across the country. The North Atlantic is the newest one to join, and we're pretty excited because we definitely have a population that deals with unique needs in fire. We have the most densely populated region, and a lot of issues on the ground that that need more attention. We have high population densities, and we have folks that are working in fire, both from the science end and from the manager's end. So part of the goal of the exchange is to facilitate communications, and this webinar is the first part of that. We did a sensing assessment recently, and as you can see from this slide, a lot of common words popped out: fire, management, science, research, people. So these are things that we're working to address through this exchange. We have 4 broad goals: to catalyze collaboration between scientists and managers, to facilitate communication flow, to determine innovative solutions, and to consolidate existing research data and synthesize actions on the ground. A lot of the things that you'll see coming from us, if you're not yet on our email list, are research briefs, newsletters, webinars. This is our first. We have a website. We're second in line, I think, to get a new exchange website. We're working on a research database, and we're going to be offering field trips and capstone workshops. So I'll post a way to join our exchange later in the webinar, but keep an eye out, and I encourage you to join our list. These are the 4 folks that are behind the exchange, and we have a whole slew of community representatives representing a range of organizations and agencies and institutions. I'll just close our brief intro presentation by saying that we're a very small but excited group of people. This is a picture from our sensing session in Amherst, Massachusetts. And a quote from Margaret Mead: "Never underestimate the power of a small group of committed people to change the world. In fact, is the only thing that ever has." So with that, I think we are ready to get started with the real highlight of today, Greg Nowacki's presentation. So just by way of introduction, Greg was born and raised in Wisconsin's Northwoods and attended the University of Wisconsin at Stevens Point, where he received a BS and MS degree in forestry and natural resources in the mid-1980s. Thereafter, Greg went eastward, successfully attaining a PhD in forestry at Penn State University. At both institutions, Greg's graduate studies were keenly focused on oak ecology, relating changes in oak abundance to land use and fire. Immediately after college, Greg served as an old-growth forest ecologist at the Nature Conservancy for 2 years prior to signing on with the U.S. Forest Service in Alaska. Greg transferred to Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 2001, where he presently serves as the Regional Ecologist and Soils Program Manager for the Eastern Region. Throughout his career, Greg has dedicated his work to facilitate the transfer of science to land management. So we're thrilled to have Greg present our first North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange webinar. And I will let him take the floor from here, and we can get started.
All right. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you for all the folks who are participating in today's call. We have a good listing of those. Today I'll be talking about mapping pyrophilic percentage across the northeastern portion of the United States using witness trees. My co-authors on this particular project are Melissa Thomas Van Gundy of the Northern Research Station with the U.S. Forest Service, and Charles Cogdell, who is a representative of Harvard Forest. The objective of this research is essentially to convert witness tree data into maps that reflect the importance of fire in pre-settlement landscapes. One might ask, why is that important? Well, essentially we're trying to establish where fire was and where it wasn't an important ecological driver for ecosystem restoration, disturbance-based forestry, and land management planning. So I do want to emphasize the fact that this information is really important in both the world of research and in land management. The study area itself encompasses the northeastern portion of the United States with focus on 5 national forests. Those are the Monongahela National Forest of West Virginia, the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania, the Finger Lakes National Forest in New York, the Green Mountain National Forest in Vermont, and lastly, the White Mountain National Forest in New Hampshire and Maine. The methods are fairly straightforward. First of all, we wanted to spatially compile witness tree data within these 5 national forests. In the east, oftentimes witness tree data was recorded via the meets and bounds system of land measurement. Consequently, it's a irregular way of marking these trees, marking corners, and it's a little bit different than what you normally would get using the conventional rectangular system of land survey. So we'll be touching on that subject a little bit as this presentation unfolds, but it's a little bit unconventional consequently in that regards. Once we've spatially compiled our witness trees, we wanted to categorize them by their pyrogenicity or fire relations. And lastly, once we have done that, we applied kriging to the point data itself to create what we call the pyrophilic percentage map. The technique itself was developed first on the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. And this particular forest is located in the east central portion of West Virginia. One thing that is quite unique about this national forest is that you have the Appalachian highlands striking through it within its center from the northeast to the southwest. Now, this technique that we'll be going through today is available in a recent publication that Melissa and I put together last year. It was published in Forest Ecology and Management. So if you want to know a little bit more about the technique, please refer to that publication. Okay, what's very important in starting this is categorizing our witness trees into 2 classes, either pyrophilic or pyrophobic, and you see those here. For pyrophilic genus and species, we were looking at traits such as thick bark, the ability to sprout, and oftentimes sprout prolifically after disturbance, xerophilic tendencies, drought tolerance, if you will, leaves that actually encourage fire due to their thickness and ability to curl, and species that have a general tendency of being early successional in nature. And you can see those pyrophilic genera listed on the left-hand side of this particular chart. On the pyrophobic end of things, we put species and genera into that category if they had a propensity of being thin-barked, having shallow roots, being mesophytic in nature, moisture-loving. If they produce leaves that generally discouraged fire, so oftentimes they would be thin, flaccid, and when they fell to the forest floor, they would maintain their wetness. And species that tended to be late sterile in nature, and species in general that generally avoid disturbance. And you see those listed on the right-hand side of the chart. Now, we did this both at the genus level that you see here and at the species level. I'm just providing the genus level here because otherwise the font size would become ridiculously small, of course. Okay, the witness tree database itself that we used on the Monongahela National Forest spanned from 1752 to roughly 1900. The pyrophilic percentage equation is listed in the middle, and it's a fairly straightforward equation. Basically, it's the number of pyrophilic trees that occur at a given spot or point divided by the total number of trees at that point multiplied by 100, giving you a percentage. Now, dealing with the meets and bounds system, as I mentioned to or alluded to up front, has its oddities. And one thing affiliated with it is oftentimes you're only dealing with one or maybe two trees that witness a corner in early land surveys. And you see that in this particular table. You can see that the vast number of trees were mainly one or two tree points. Consequently, many of our points would register either 100% pyrophilic tendencies, as you see up on this particular row, or they would register 0%. They were just made up of pyrophobic trees. So there was a lot of spikiness, if you will, when you were dealing with the point data itself. But thank goodness for kriging. It is a wonderful way of smoothing out the data, and indeed it did so, and we'll be getting to that very shortly. In total, we had over 14,000 witness trees that were compiled and used in this particular research. It can be, the data itself, the point data can be displayed in a number of different ways. We have shown 4 different ways on the right-hand side. We can look at the pyrophobic points represented by blue dots in this particular panel. These are the pyrophilic points represented by red dots in panel B. And we can do a number of overlays, one of which is the pyrophobic points overlaid on the pyrophilics. And we can do just the opposite as well, showing the pyrophilic points overlaid on pyrophobic points. We'll just stay here on this particular panel just to point out a few things. Earlier I mentioned that you have the Appalachian highlands striking across the Monongahela National Forest from the northeast to the southwest. And you can see how our pyrophobic points correspond so nicely with the higher portions of the Appalachians as they strike across this national forest. So you can see a high concentration of blue dots at the higher elevations in this particular area. And then likewise, you can note how our pyrophilic points, represented by red dots here, concentrated themselves more on the edges, on the western and eastern edges of this particular national forest. So it seemed like there was a very strong association with the topography of this particular landscape. Now when we took these data and krigged them, voila, this is the map that we ended up with. The pyrophilic percentages themselves, we ended up dividing those into equal classes by 10 percentage points, and you see those listed at the lower right-hand corner from 0 to 10 all the way to 91 to 100%. So we had 10 classes. We applied a color gradient to show where fire was very important, as you see listed in red at the lower category, grading into green. Those particular pyrophilic percentage classes are quite low, and historically, of course, probably did not burn or didn't burn very often. So applying the kriging on the data points, we ended up with this map. And again, I do want to point out this strong concentration of pyrophobic tendencies represented by the green colors as they occur across this national forest. Again, striking from the northeast to the southwest, right through the central portion of this national forest. So these represent the highest elevations of this particular area. Of course, these are areas that probably do get much more rainfall and precipitation in general because of orographic effects, clouds moving in from the west, moving up in elevation, dumping their load as they go from west to east. The areas that have high pyrophilic percentages, represented by oranges and reds, you can see occur generally at the lower elevations in the southeast quadrant, in the rain shadow around Seneca Rocks and eastward, in other valley systems such as the Tigard Valley, River Valley around Huttonsville. I mentioned this to Melissa several times after she generated this particular map via kriging, that this is the most sensical database I've ever been associated with in all my years of research or dabbling in research, and that's 30 plus years now. Anybody who has conducted research out there in the audience knows that oftentimes you don't get databases that produce results that you would like to see or were thinking you were going to see. But this one tied so beautifully, so wonderfully into the landscape itself here in the central Appalachians. The pyrophilic percentage corresponded very closely with climate and with elevational gradient that we saw in this area. Specifically, we saw a very low pyrophilic percentage, again, occurring at higher elevations, areas where you have increased precipitation, again, due to the orographic effect, areas that tend to be cooler, represented by increase in frost days and a low value of growing days. And the mean annual temperature of these higher elevations were low. So this all made sense. These forested ecosystems that largely did not burn, made up of northern hardwoods and red spruce dominated communities, occurred on these high areas. Conversely, areas that had a very high pyrophilic percentage, again, occurred at lower elevations. These are areas that tended to get less precipitation. They had higher temperatures by and large, and they had a longer growing season. And also, when you think about where Native Americans probably historically had their villages, their encampments, heavy-duty activity regarding agriculture, and perhaps the tending of wildlands around their villages and encampments, this would be the area where they would be hanging on the landscape, and perhaps a very important igniter of fires at these lower elevations. So not only does this make sense ecologically, this pattern that you see here displayed in the different colors, but it also makes sense from a human history standpoint, a societal standpoint, where Native Americans were largely concentrated on this otherwise very rugged terrain. So again, we were very excited by how the witness trees converted into this pyrophilic percentage when we applied kriging to the individual witness tree data points. We think this is very management relevant, and it has a lot of relevancy, of course, for research as well. Consequently, we had the opportunity to expand this research, this mapping project, to 4 additional national forests. And those are the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania, Finger Lakes, the Green Mountain, and the White Mountain National Forest in New Hampshire and Maine. As a matter of fact, these 4 national forests contributed funding for this particular project, which we are appreciative of. Now, since we went through the specific methods of how to generate these maps, we'll proceed a little bit more rapidly here. These are the individual witness tree points converted over to as pyrophobes or pyrophiles. Blue being the pyrophobes, of course, red being the pyrophile points. The data itself was collected between 1790 and about 1900 and encompasses roughly 3,000 witness trees themselves. So you can see how these two groups or categorizations of witness trees are spatially distributed across the landscape. And applying kriging to that particular point data set, this is what we ended up with. Again, we have the same legend, the same classification as we were dealing with before. The green coloration are those areas that have a very low pyrophilic percentage. Those with the warmer colors, the yellows, oranges, and reds, have a higher pyrophilic percentage. We can see that over the majority of the Allegheny National Forest that it had a fairly low pyrophilic percentage, and this makes sense. These are areas that were historically dominated by pyrophobic species such as hemlock, sugar maple, beech, basswood. It was effectively a conifer northern hardwoods that existed on this high plateau. But please note that there actually were areas that had higher pyrophilic percentages located along the western boundary of this particular national forest. And I'm pointing out those areas now. So it kind of makes you scratch your head. Well, what was going on here? Why do you have this tongue of high pyrophilic percentage radiating up this particular area? Well, when we superimpose Native American villages, known Native American villages, onto the map, you get a good feel for what was going on here historically. These Native American villages were located along the Allegheny River. That river runs along the western portions of this particular national forest, and you can see the strong association between where Native Americans were living on the landscape, their travel corridors between their villages and encampments, which was in this case the Allegheny River, and where fire was occurring on this particular landscape. This too correlates well with findings of Brian Black and Abrams and others in an article that they published about 10 years ago, pointing out this strong association between Native Americans and pyrophilic tendencies. Okay, this is the Finger Lakes National Forest. This is based on data from the late 1700s and comprises about 600 witness trees. Again, we have the two types, the pyrophobes in blue and the pyrophiles in red. Applying kriging. This is the map that was generated. You can see that the middle portions of the Finger Lakes National Forest, and this is essentially the interfluve between the two lakes, the high portion between these two lakes, principally green, meaning that they are mainly pyrophobic in nature, dominated again by northern hardwoods, sugar maple, and beech. And you see a strong pyrophilic tendency right along the shoreline itself of Lake Seneca in these locations. So what was going on here? Well, if we superimpose, we have two Native Native American villages that we found in this area. As a matter of fact, there are a couple of more that we don't even depict on this map occurring on the southern ends of these two lakes. But Lake Seneca and the villages that occurred along the east side of that particular lake were basically the seeds of ignitions of fire. And then when you think, couple that with prevailing westerly winds, you can see what was the tendency of this particular landscape. That is, you had Native American activities, villages, and trails, and canoe routes right along the eastern side of Seneca Lake. Fires either deliberately set or perhaps accidentally set that would then burn into the landscape eastwardly, and basically they would poop out once they hit that inner fluve area, or the highland, the ridge that separates these two lakes within this national forest. Okay, going on to the Green Mountain National Forest, further to the northeast. This is based on about 100 years of survey data from the 1700s into the late 1800s, 1,000 witness trees approximately. And one thing that stands out here is the high concentration of blue dots. So when we apply the kriging technique here, not surprisingly, this map turns out largely green. Indeed, in this case, the Green Mountain National Forest lives up to its name, highly pyrophobic. I do want to point out at this time that that doesn't mean that small patches of land within this pyrophilic matrix did not burn, because indeed there are locations that probably did burn and probably did so repetitively, particularly at higher elevations, southwestern facing upper slopes, those areas that were prone to lightning strikes. And indeed, there probably was a small footprint of Native American activities on the landscape itself. We tried to identify Native American villages of this area, and we secured 2 of them. They were off-site, basically. They didn't register themselves close to the area, study area here. Okay, going on to the White Mountain National Forest. You can see the survey dates on the upper portion of this slide. A little over 700 witness trees making up this database. Again, you see the strong propensity of blue dots scattered throughout this map. And when krigged, we see that the pyrophilic percentage was quite low throughout this particular landscape. We were able to locate some Native American sites on this particular area. You see those here in the stars. But generally, at least on the White Mountain National Forest proper, seemingly they didn't have a large effect on the fire regime in this particular area. Now, the White Mountain National Forest encompasses very high elevations, tending to be more cool, dominated by conifer northern hardwood systems by and large. Areas where Native Americans probably largely avoided. They did occur in these areas, and I'm sure they used these areas of as hunting grounds and for other uses. But seemingly they didn't have a strong footprint when it comes up to fire regimes. Lastly, we had an opportunity, particularly working with Charlie Cogbill, to apply this technique on a regional level based on town-compiled witness tree data. We had a total of about 700 towns that were part of the base data set. And this is information that Charlie himself compiled. So this is based on data that was compiled at a town-by-town basis. He made a listing of multiple witness trees that occurred within these towns, and we could calculate a pyrophilic percentage value for each one of these towns. And using those as centroids, we could produce this particular map through kriging, as we explained earlier. again using the same classification and also color palette. One thing that very much jumps out at you is the fact that we have pyrophobic systems that are dominating the northern portion of the New England area, and largely pyrophilic systems that are occurring in the southern portion. I don't know how many of you are familiar with John Curtis and his work in Wisconsin, but it was John who largely made the tension zone line famous. Basically, this is a zone by which northern and southern species come together, at least across the northern tier of the United States of America. It also seems to be a line that corresponds to changes in the major processes that are driving forest systems, whereby wind seems to be the major influence north of that line, and fire seems to be the major process driving ecosystems to the south. Now, using the 50% pyrophilic percentage line, we were able to replicate that tension zone line here in the eastern United States, and you see that in the black line radiating through the middle. And again, this is a very important line because it essentially divides the New England area, the northeastern portion of the United States, into two major ecological zones. To the north, the matrix is made up of pyrophobic ecosystems, mainly conifer northern hardwood systems, within which you do have some burning that takes place. We've seen that on the Finger Lakes, in the green and the white. So there is fire in this landscape, but it tends to be very much localized. The background matrix is very much pyrophobic in nature. When you go south of this particular line, you see that fire is much more ubiquitous across that landscape, and this is where you have oak pine systems historically dominating across this southern portion of New England. Now, it doesn't mean that you didn't have some pyrophobic communities occurring within this landscape to the south, because indeed they did. You had topographic barriers to fire, you had areas that were extremely wet, and you had other ecological phenomenon that would allow pyrophobic communities to exist within this larger pyrophilic landscape. So I just want to point that out, that indeed you have both these communities that are occurring across this line, but it's really the matrix that is important here, with pyrophobic tendencies dominating to the north, where wind-driven processes tend to dominate, and where fire tends to be the major driver south of that particular line. And this is just those individual maps effectively superimposed on this particular regional map. And it was really nice to see the spatial relationships between what we developed locally for the National Forest and what we developed based on this regional map, again based on town level compiled data that we got from Charlie. Okay, so in conclusions, we saw that kriging was a very effective method in converting witness tree point data into spatial covers depicting fire importance, specifically pyrophilic percentage. Fire was formerly most important in the westernmost national forest, in this case the Allegheny, and it decreased eastward along the 4 national forests that we concentrated on at the end of this presentation. The fire regimes were closely associated with Native American settlements and travel corridors on the Allegheny and Finger Lakes National Forests, but there seemed to be really no association on the national forests farther east on the green and the white. There are 2 very distinct fire regimes that occur in the northeast that are divided by the tension zone line. We have the pyrophobic conifer northern hardwood forest to the north, and we have the pyrophilic oak pine system to the south. And this is very important from a research standpoint and land management standpoint. From a research standpoint, I have seen a multitude of articles produced over the years that would treat New England as a whole in explaining its ecology. Of course, sometimes they would get into more detail, dividing the northern portion from the southern portion in this regards. But really, these are two very distinct ecosystems at the broad scale. And research needs to recognize that. And when you're doing research north of that tension zone line in south, they need to be divided in that manner. You can't really combine those data sets because the ecosystems are behaving very differently, at least historically speaking, in pre-settlement times. Land management, of course, can benefit tremendously from this information. We don't want to go out and introduce fire in systems that are pyrophobic in nature, that didn't burn historically. It doesn't make any sense. We don't necessarily need fire, for instance, to regenerate northern hardwoods, do we? And we don't do that anyway. But whereas fire is a very important silvicultural tool in regenerating oak and pine systems south of the tension zone line. So, with that, I will open it up for questions, convey it over to, I guess, Amanda at this time.
Well, first of all, everyone, I'm sure we're silently thanking Greg. Thank you, Greg, so much for that presentation. That was really, really informative. And while you were talking, we had a number of people with a few really interesting questions to kind of start us off. So we'll all imagine a standing ovation round of applause. And I'd like to start by bringing up the first question. Beth Buchanan asks, does Greg have a history of Native American villages in present-day Monongahela National Forest also?
That's something that Melissa and I have talked about. She has some locations at this time. I believe that she would like to pursue this farther in working with the state to get Native American sites into her hands, superimpose that on our pyrophilic percentage map, and see whether a strong relationship exists between that map and in the locations of Native Americans. I suspect there would be a very strong association, but that is a work that's in works.
Great. Thank you, Greg. So I see a couple more questions are popping up. I'm going to address the questions that are in the chat box first before we test the broad participation phone lines. So the next question that we had was from Jeff Niza. Is there a way to figure out where the fires, deliberate or not, quote unquote, pooped out or disappeared?
Yeah, I used that statement when talking about the Finger Lakes National Forest. One could superimpose this pyrophilic percentage map on a topographic map and see the relations between where you have the system flipping from stronger pyrophilic tendencies to pyrophobic ones. And that particular line that strikes across the middle portion of the Finger Lakes National Forest, I'm sure corresponds with some topographic break. It was under my it was my observation by which it seemed to be topographically driven, that the warmer west-facing slopes on the Finger Lakes National Forest were burning, and once those fires rode up to near the ridge top that divides that area between the two lakes that we saw, that's seemingly where those fires dissipated historically, and you had a stronger component of pyrophobes, which would be sugar maple, red maple, beech, perhaps hemlock. So you could get at that by relating those two databases, that is the pyrophilic percentage map and topographic maps. Hopefully I answered that question. adequately.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and Jeff, if you're out there and you have a follow-up question, I see you at one, feel free to enter it in the chat box. I'm going to keep going in order. Craig Kostrowski had a couple of comments. He said, first, looking at current stand data on the ANF, there are stands that had low to no occurrence of witness trees, however, are typed out with pyrophilic species. It would be interesting to combine witness tree data and current data to fill in gaps in witness tree data. And he also says, I believe that it would strengthen the overall map of fire occurrence, especially when combines the topography and distance to the Allegheny River and other water sources. Would you like to comment on that, Greg?
Yes, I could. I think he raises a good point in that the tree species that oftentimes we see today would relate to the tree species that occurred in pre-settlement times. The only caveat with that is the fact that there has been a profound European signal on current compositions due to the great cutover and many burnovers that took place spanning from the 1600s, late 1600s onward, depending upon your location in the east. So you do have to be careful because of the fact that we have seen, for instance, many northern hardwood stands convert over to aspen birch after the great cutover and multiple burnovers throughout the north. And if we used current data based on what I just explained, that would light up red, wouldn't it? It would light up as pyrophilic when in actuality it was a pyrophobic ecosystem. So point well made, but there are caveats, of course, that one has to deal with when interpreting or blending modern day data with pre-settlement data.
Yeah, very true. I'll just read Craig's next comment. He said, would love to be a part of future research.
Great. Melissa and I are looking for partners in this regards. Just so everybody knows, we have extended this particular method into Minnesota. At this time, we have generated a map for the forested sectors of Minnesota, which is the eastern two-thirds of that particular state. We did find that this method doesn't work all that well once you get into the central plains portions of Minnesota. That would be the far western portions of Minnesota. So, but we're tinkering with other things in that particular area.
Yeah, that's interesting. I imagine there wouldn't be quite as many witness trees in the plains of Minnesota as in the forests of New England or pre-settlement New England.
Yeah. Once you get out in those plains, they tend to be concentrated along creeks, and they're actually hydrophiles. That's what they represent.
All right, I'm going to go to the next question. We have a number of great questions that are coming in the chat box. Jeff also asks, how do we know that the Native Americans didn't contribute some, quote, white noise that might have influenced where the tension zone line was referenced? In parentheses, how sure are we that Curtis's line is correct?
Well, based on the crenulation, I'll try to answer this as best as possible. Based on the crenulations of this tension zone line that we see in the east, and matter of fact, maybe, I don't know if I can use this map. We do think that that line is controlled in part by human ignitions. There are several things that are coming together here for the tension zone line. One, of course, is overriding climate of this area. Cooler climates, moister climates tend to be north of that line, and it drops into warmer climates south of that line. So that's one factor that's driving the line placement. The second factor is topography itself. You can see the crenulations here where the lines go northward into the green zone, and I'm just pointing those out with the arrow as we speak. So they tend to be following river valleys in fingering themselves, this pyrophilic tendencies, fingering themselves into this otherwise pyrophobic landscape to the north. That's quite interesting, and so there's a topographic signal there as well. Now lastly, it's the human component. Where did Native Americans largely reside on this landscape? And if we remember the Allegheny example, the populations oftentimes tended to be along river corridors. That's where they had their villages, encampments, and that's where they traveled principally, particularly when you get into increasingly rugged topography. And that you can see in this particular map based on what I just explained with topography. That is this interfingering of pyrophilic tendencies into the pyrophobic landscape to the north. So all three of those factors seemingly are merging together to dictate this line, this tension zone line. Now one can argue that, and we've seen that today with musification across the eastern United States, that without fire, we see that south of the tension zone line, we have fire-sensitive, shade-tolerant trees that are regenerating, recruiting, and actually basically converting many of our oak forests over in that direction, that is sugar maple, red maple, and whatnot. So it makes one think that, well, what was the big igniter of this landscape historically? And definitely, I can speak for myself. I think Native Americans were the major driver of burning that landscape, making it as ubiquitous as it was south of the tension zone line. And the line itself might be largely dictated by human activity of the past. And I say that as a personal observation. I don't want to incriminate my co-authors in that manner, although maybe they agree with me.
Yeah, definitely the role of Native Americans in shaping the fire landscape is a huge topic. So thanks again for addressing that. I'm going to go on with more questions. There's some really great questions that are coming up, but Fred had a pretty easy one for you. He says, I just lost it. He said, where can I get a map showing the tension line for the Northeast? We manage lands on both sides of the line, and it would be good for education purposes.
Well, this particular work that I just conveyed to the group, that is the 4 national forests, will be coming out in a GTR very shortly. Charlie and Melissa and I are working it as we speak. As a matter of fact, it's practically in press right now. So you can look forward to that within probably 3 to 4 months here. That will be out.
Great. All right. Oh, more questions keep popping up. Joe Marshall asks, how does the distribution of red pine north of the tension zone relate to your pyrophobicity conclusions? There must be pyrophilic areas. There must be pyrophilic areas within the green zone. Any idea of how much?
Right. Yes, there are red pine. There's eastern white pine that occur north of the tension zone line. This is where there's a issue with scale. That is, the majority of witness trees that were used for our 4 national forests tended to be pyrophobic in nature. They tended to be sugar maple, beech, basswood, hemlock. And there were only a few that were identified as pyrophilic in nature. I'm talking more specifically perhaps on the Green Mountain and White Mountain here. So just because you had such few representatives of pyrophobes or pyrophiles, it didn't really manifest itself very well in the kriging. It was washed out, if you will, by the applying kriging to the individual data points. And that's why and hopefully I conveyed this to the group, you have to be cautious. That is, even though that the Green Mountain and White Mountain come across as largely green, that is pyrophobic in nature, you can have these small little isolated landscapes where fire was important. And surely there are red pine that occur historically in the northern portion of New England. And in those locations, one would expect fire. It just wasn't a very dominant genus or species, and consequently didn't manifest itself in the kriging of witness trees.
Very interesting. I'll just add, Inga noted that when the GTR comes out, we're definitely going to put it in the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange newsletter. The follow-up comment to Joe's question was one of the ANF increase of data may or may not be strong enough to potentially sway the tension line, which runs through our southwest portion of the forest. So I think that was more of a comment than a question. I'll go on to Tyler Briggs's question. There is an obvious archipelago of pyrophilic biodiversity across northern New England and north of the tension zone. What accounts for these systems not coming out in this analysis scale?
Again, I would say it's in part due to the scale question. When we applied kriging to the point data set, it produced a broad scale map by and large. I was excited, I guess I could, or intrigued by the fact that the higher pyrophilic percentages did manifest themselves in the Finger Lakes National Forest. There we know that there was a high concentration of Seneca Indians historically, and as a matter of fact, I can use this map as well. You can see that there's a blotch of yellow occurring in that general area. So indeed, there are these areas where you might have a higher concentration of Native Americans on the landscape within this larger pyrophobic landscape, and where you had Native Americans, seemingly you had increased a fire occurring on the landscape. And indeed, we did see that in the Finger Lakes National Forest, even though it's smack dab in the middle of this larger pyrophobic matrix.
Interesting. And again, I think the question of scale is coming up. Inga Lapuma is asking, what is the role of areas that were glaciated in relation to pyrophobic species and the northeast tension zone line?
Okay, there is some relationship. If we look at the furthest terminus of the Wisconsin glaciation, that corresponds effectively with Long Island, the northeastern portions of New Jersey. So you can see that the line itself seems to be close to the glaciation in Pennsylvania, but it deviates from that when you get into the northern portions of New Jersey. So is there a relationship? Yes, generally, but it's not a one-to-one relationship. It really misses the southern portion of New England. That's where it really deviates from northern New Jersey northward into Maine. That area was all glaciated, but yet, based on this map, it was highly pyrophilic, that southern portion.
Interesting. I'm going to go on to Diane's question. She says, there seem to be large gaps in point data on the Green Mountain National Forest. Can you speak to that? Was there really that much missing witness tree data?
My co-author probably could answer that question better, Melissa. That is the data that was conveyed to us from Charlie Cogbill. Charlie, being a very thorough individual, I would say has done his best to identify witness tree data and compile it. Indeed, further investigations can be made to help fill out that point data set, and we welcome that from any of the national forests to help us out in that regard to build a more robust map.
Great. I see Craig has another comment/question. I think just in the interest of making sure we address everybody's questions, sorry Craig, I'm going to move on to Yvette Dickinson's question. Have you compared the historic tension line from witness tree data to the current tension line using modern species distribution?
We have not, and I think that's an avenue of future research. Again, the mesification phenomenon that's taking place across the eastern United States is profound, and seemingly that tension zone line is rapidly pushing southward. When you follow shade-tolerant, fire-sensitive species like sugar maple and red maple, beech, basswood, things like that. So definitely there seems to be a shift going on here. That's why I would say that Native American burning was what was principally driving this line historically that you see on screen right now. And without those ignitions today, we see these more northern mesophytes marching promptly south, or I shouldn't say marching, they're just expanding from the refugia in the south. And that's very well documented. So I guess with that said, one could come to the conclusion that it was really Native Americans that really drove the placement of this tension zone line, because right now it seems to be obliterated, and we have this tremendous surge of mesophytic, shade-tolerant, fire-sensitive species occurring throughout the East, and that's because of Smoky Bear syndrome and the lack of landscape fire today.
Cool. We're getting close on time. I want to be sure to get in Bill Patterson's question. He says, how do you relate pyro percentage to fire rotation or fire return interval? That is important in terms of being able to interpret your results in the context of fire management at the scale upon which fire managers develop FMPs.
Most definitely. That's very important, and unfortunately there is not a one-to-one correlation between pyrophilic percentage and any of those other variables or parameters that Bill points out here. This is a map that essentially states how important fire was in the pre-settlement landscape based on witness trees. And when it comes up to specific rotations, what type of fire regimes, it doesn't speak to that specifically. One could make generalizations that where you have very high pyrophilic percentages and just understanding of what ecosystems existed in those locations, most of the time it's pine oak systems, that you probably had a fairly frequent fire regime, maybe every 5 to 10 years, and those burns were probably low to mixed severity of those type of burns that would creep through, or it would be surface burns that would creep through duff and litter and top kill individual trees that were probably 2 to 3 inches in diameter and less. Mainly affecting ecosystems from below rather than from above. But yeah, you can't really, there's not a one-to-one correlation between that and those variables, unfortunately.
All right, does anybody out there in the last couple of minutes have any burning questions that you'd like to put in the chat box? I'll give folks a moment to type something up and perhaps enter. While that's happening, as we're winding down, I just want to make a few quick announcements. In the chat box, and Norm Borg has a question, so we'll address that in just a moment. Again, I just want to say that credits are being offered by Society of American Foresters, so if you need an email or hard copy certificate, then put it in the chat box or email me. Also, this webinar is being recorded, and until we have our brand new North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange website coming soon, then it will be housed on the Forest Guild website, and I can send out information about that as well as Greg's contact info. Also, there's some questions that have come up about Native American use of fire. One of the first field trips co-sponsored by our exchange is going to be in the southeastern Massachusetts Pine Barrens. So we'll have a chance. We're actually going to be spending some of the time on Mashpee Wampanoag tribal land. So you'll have a chance to talk with their natural resource manager and ask some of these questions in person. So I see we have a few questions that have popped up in the chat window. Since we're getting close to the top of the hour, I want to say that we'll continue taking questions, and I will probably open up the phone line as well. So you're welcome to stay on. And in the meantime, please feel free to contact me or anyone from the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange with your thoughts and ideas on the webinar. So with that, I'm going to continue with the next question from Norman Borg. He says, how well does the witness tree data composition compare with pollen core data from the same period?
A very good question. Actually, I've dabbled into this subject matter recently. Not very well, because of the fact that you oftentimes have trees that are overrepresented in pollen in many trees that are underrepresented in pollen, so you have to be very careful. For instance, Pinus and Quercus are two genera that tend to produce high volumes of pollen relative to maple, Acer for instance, that produces very low volumes of pollen. So the pollen database, when you look at it one-to-one with witness trees, doesn't correspond necessarily all that well. Now, over the years, actually starting from Margaret Davis's work, I believe, and actually even prior to that, but correction factors have been produced by which you can take pollen and correct the amount of pollen so it represents the type of vegetation occurring on that site better. But there are limitations with correction values in that regards, and I'm not going to go there because it becomes much too sophisticated a conversation. But just be aware that pollen data doesn't necessarily correspond well to witness tree data, because you have certain tree genera that are overproducers and others that are far underproducers, and that makes it funky trying to compare the two.
Yeah, very interesting. I think a final question for now in the chat box. Lane asks, when will the Minnesota maps be published or made available?
We do have the map in hand at this time, and we are working on the manuscript as we speak. As a matter of fact, I'm going to be dedicating this particular month to writing that up with Melissa. So our draft will be probably done at the end of this month or the beginning of January, and then it goes through a review process. That too probably will be produced as a GTR, a general technical report, and I suspect that will take place sometime next year, maybe in the summer.
Great. Bill Patterson had a final comment, I think, to the previous question. He says, I agree, not very well, but based more on charcoal data in sediments versus pollen percentages or absolute pollen frequencies. APF correlate pretty well with PA.
Yeah, and knowing Bill was on the line, I was a little hesitant to answer that question because he's the master in that realm. So you had me sweating there a little bit.
Well, you're probably not the last person to sweat. All right, so we are now just after noon Eastern time. Do we have any final questions from folks for the chat window? I'll give folks just a moment. Again, we can imagine a standing ovation, round of applause, and a huge thank you to you, Greg, for taking the time to present this research to us. There will be more webinars for the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange, and if you have thoughts on topics that you would like to hear, again, please contact us. You can type something in the chat window, or you can contact me or one of the other coordinators directly. Let's see, we still have a number of people on the line. Xander, do you think we should open up the phone line in case anyone wants to ask a question out loud? Looks like we're getting a lot of thank yous in the chat box.
There's likely to be a lot of noise. I think you've got a lot of good questions, and it probably makes sense to wrap it up here.
Great. Well, Greg, thank you once again. And if anyone has questions or you need contact info or you have follow-up questions, again, please contact me, and we'll have Greg's contact info and a link to the webinar recording after this. And again, if you need SAF credits, then please let me know. Thanks again, Greg. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.